A city was hours from collapse. An empire was certain it had already won. And then, out of the morning mist on a ridge above Vienna, armored horsemen appeared where they shouldn't have been. September 12th, 1683 is often told as a miracle story. 18,000 versus 300,000. The truth is different in the numbers, but even more shocking in the meaning, because the victory wasn't magic. It was timing, terrain, psychology, and one fatal obsession that turned strength into weakness. Stay with me, because 3 revelations explain why Vienna didn't fall. First, the real secret weapon that made Sobieski's cavalry worth far more than a head count. Second, how Kara Mustafa Pasha's prestige and luxury mindset quietly poisoned his siege at the worst possible moment. And third, how a dying city's last desperate gamble helped trigger the charge that changed Europe's strategic future. Now, picture Central Europe in 1683, not as a united powerhouse, but as a nervous patchwork of states, rival dynasties and competing interests, where alliances were fragile and trust was rare. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, was one of the great superpowers of the era, experienced at campaigning, skilled at siege warfare, and capable of projecting force deep into the continent. Vienna mattered because it wasn't just a city. It was a hinge on the Danube, a political center of the Habsburg lands, and a gateway into the heart of Central Europe. Take it, and you don't instantly conquer Europe. History is never that clean, but you shift momentum, intimidate rivals, open routes, and force enemies to fight on ground you choose. The man tasked with delivering that triumph was Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, a serious administrator and veteran leader whose ambition was not simply to win, but to win in a way that would be remembered as unmistakably his. Inside Vienna stood Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the commander of the defense, a hard soldier with the one trait that matters most in siege. He refused to accept the idea of collapse. And racing toward the city from the north was King John III Sobieski of Poland-Lithuania, a legendary cavalry commander, older now, carrying the aches of long campaigning, but still the kind of leader whose presence could reorganize an entire army's confidence. Politically, Sobieski and the Habsburg court were not natural friends. European politics were messy, full of rivalry and suspicion, and gratitude was never guaranteed. So why did Sobieski come? Because if Vienna fell, the strategic pressure wouldn't vanish. It would move. The fire line would creep toward Poland's sphere, and the next crisis wouldn't be theoretical. Sobieski didn't ride for romance. He rode because the map demanded it. In early July 1683, the Ottoman host appeared before Vienna. Contemporary witnesses argued over the size because massed armies are hard to count, and fear inflates numbers faster than mathematics. But most modern historians place the Ottoman force roughly around 90,000 to 120,000. Still enormous for the age, still enough to swallow smaller armies whole. They brought elite infantry like the Janissaries, large numbers of cavalry suited for harassment and controlled countryside, and, most importantly for a siege, engineers and sappers who knew how to turn earth and powder into collapsing stone. Artillery began to pound the fortifications, not as random noise, but as methodical pressure, the steady message of siege warfare. We have time, we have supplies, and your walls are only a countdown. Vienna's defenses had modern features, angled bastions and overlapping fields of fire designed to resist cannon. Yet no fortress is immortal when the enemy has weeks to dig, place mines, and grind down morale. The siege settled into a rhythm that feels almost unbearable even to imagine. Bombardment above ground, mining below it, exhaustion everywhere. Day after day the walls were hit, repaired, hit again. Starhemberg's defenders patched breaches and built secondary barriers behind damaged sections, refusing to give the Ottomans the clean break they wanted. Then the war went underground. Ottoman miners dug tunnels toward the bastions, intending to place massive powder charges beneath key points and detonate them into open wounds. Vienna's men listened through the earth, count a mine, and fought in pitch darkness in spaces so tight that formation and elegance meant nothing, just nerves, knives, and the panic of suffocation. Every successful mine threatened disaster, because one properly placed explosion could open a breach wide enough for elite infantry to pour through. Meanwhile, the city's true enemy tightened its grip. Hunger. Food stocks shrank, prices soared, disease spread, and strength drained away. And still the city held, not because it was comfortable, but because Starhemberg kept the defenders believing the one thing a besieged city must believe: someone is coming. Outside, a relief coalition gathered. Imperial and German contingents, Austrian forces, various princes sending troops, and among them, the force that would become legend. Sobieski's Poles, including the elite heavy cavalry remembered as the Winged Hussars. Their march was brutal. Armies don't move like single creatures. They move like long, vulnerable lines, wagons, supply trains, exhausted men, horses wearing down. Every day loss mattered, because Vienna's margin for survival was measured in hours, not weeks. And the coalition did something that sieges are designed to prevent. They arrived in time. In early September, the relief army reached the heights overlooking Vienna, the Kahlenberg and surrounding ridges, and from there, they could see the Ottoman siege works spread out like a system of trenches, batteries, camps, and earthworks wrapping the city in pressure. Here's the first mental shift. When you're besieged, the enemy feels like the center of the world. When a relief army stands above the siege, the besiegers suddenly look exposed, stretched out, forced to face two directions at once. Kara Mustafa had not expected the relief force so soon. That doesn't mean he was careless. He could respond, and he did. But siege posture is not the same as battle posture. A siege army is optimized for control pressure over weeks. A field battle demands fast coordination, flexible reserves, and immediate communication. The more complex your system, the slower it turns. And that's where the day's hidden weakness waited. Dawn, September 12, 1683. Coalition forces began descending from the hills, with infantry engaging first, fighting through uneven terrain, woods, and villages where each position became a stubborn contest. This matters, because the famous cavalry charge was not the whole battle. It was a final act after hours of grinding combat that wore nerves thin and pulled units out of place. Ottoman troops resisted hard, and there were moments when coalition sections bent under counterattacks. But as the morning and midday fighting intensified, Kara Mustafa had to shift more troops to meet the threat from the heights, and that meant fewer troops focused on pressing Vienna at the same intensity. And inside the city, Starhemberg saw something rare, an opening. He made a decision that looks insane on paper, but brilliant in context. He ordered a sortie. Vienna's gates opened, and defenders struck outward into Ottoman siege lines. These were not fresh men. Many were exhausted and hungry, but psychologically the effect was enormous. An army that believes a city is nearly dead does not expect the city to punch in the face. Now Ottoman units were being pressured from above by the relief army and disrupted near the siege works by defenders attacking from inside the almost conquered city. This is Revelation 3. The dying city's gamble multiplied confusion and forced the besiegers into a two-front emergency at the exact moment they needed clarity most. Mid-afternoon approached, and the battlefield became a test of endurance. Men were tired, water was precious, ammunition limited, and lines had been bending and reforming for hours. This is the kind of moment where cautious advice sounds smart. Wait, consolidate, fight tomorrow. Some Allied leaders urged that approach. But Sobieski read the battlefield like a storm front. He recognized that the Ottomans were stretched, partially oriented toward different threats, and struggling to coordinate rapid changes across a huge force. And here comes Revelation 2. Kara Mustafa's obsession with prestige and a perfect victory had shaped a siege built to control a city, not to instantly reorganize into a clean field defense under surprise pressure. He wanted Vienna as a trophy, intact enough to be valuable and symbolic, and that mindset encouraged caution at moments when decisive risk might have ended the siege earlier. Now that same caution and that same heavy siege structure made rapid adaptation harder. Sobieski understood something that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. You don't win by doing what is safe. You win by doing what the moment demands before the moment disappears. If the coalition waited until tomorrow, the Ottomans could rebuild their cohesion, realign artillery, form deeper defensive structures, and, most important, recover confidence. So Sobieski gathered the cavalry, not just Polish riders, but cavalry elements across the coalition, forming a mass often estimated around 18,000 horsemen for decisive action, with the Polish heavy cavalry, including roughly 3,000 winged hussars at the center. And now Revelation 1, the real secret weapon. It was never just the wings. The wings are iconic, and yes, They amplified intimidation, but the true weapon was a system: terrain, timing, mass, and doctrine. Downhill ground multiplies momentum. Late-day fatigue makes reaction slower. A coordinated heavy cavalry shock, delivered when enemy formations are stretched and half-turned, can shatter cohesion faster than gunfire can restore it. Sobieski wasn't betting on spectacle. He was betting on physics and psychology at the same time. The cavalry formed on the heights. Priests moved among the ranks. Banners lifted, armor tightened, lances leveled. Below, Ottoman troops were not helpless, but they were strained, and strain is what turns a disciplined army into something fragile. Then the order came. The movement began controlled, because great cavalry charges are not chaos. First a steady descent, then pace increasing, alignment holding, horses building speed, and weight into a single moving force. Thousands of hooves turned the hillside into thunder. Ottoman defenders tried to respond. Officers shouting, units attempting to pivot, some infantry tightening into defensive shapes. But battle reality is never uniform. Some units had time to form properly. Others were caught mid-move. Others simply couldn't see what was happening fast enough to become the shape they needed to be. And then the cavalry hit, not as a single movie-frame collision, but as a chain reaction, a breakthrough where the line was weakest, widening gaps, localized retreats, and then the spreading belief, the most dangerous thing in war, that retreat is the only way to survive. That is how routes happen. Not because every soldier is a coward, but because once cohesion breaks, even brave men can't fight effectively. They can only try not to die. The long lances of the heavy cavalry struck first, outranging defenders, driving into crowded positions, and the follow-through mattered as much as the impact. Disciplined riders pushing forward, exploiting openings, turning a crack into a split. The wings, whether they whistled audibly or simply looked otherworldly in the light, added to the shock. Imagine you fought all day. You've heard that the city was nearly yours. You've been told reinforcements won't arrive. And then you look uphill and see a moving wall of armored horsemen descending with terrifying speed. In that moment, the mind does what minds always do under extreme uncertainty. It searches for an explanation that fits fear. Once panic begins in one place, it spreads like fire through dry grass, because every man who sees another man running receives a brutal message. He knows something you don't. And suddenly Kara Mustafa's greatest strength, his vast force, becomes a weakness. Orders take time to travel. Units interpret commands differently. The bigger the machine, the slower it turns. Under a siege plan, that's manageable. Under a sudden collapse of cohesion, it's deadly. By evening, Kara Mustafa's position became untenable. The Ottoman army withdrew, leaving behind artillery pieces, supplies, and much of the material footprint of a massive campaign. Vienna, starving, damaged, exhausted, survived. Sobieski entered the abandoned camp and saw wealth and logistics on a scale few Europeans had ever witnessed. The evidence that this had not been a minor raid, but a major strategic effort. The captured supplies mattered as much as the symbolism, because food, powder, and equipment can decide what happens next. Sobieski wrote a famous message to Pope Innocent XI. Veni, vidi, Deus visit. I came, I saw, God conquered, crediting victory providence rather than ego, and also sending a political signal. This was a relief that could unite rivals, at least for a moment. But European politics never stay pure for long. Emperor Leopold I returned eager to reclaim authority and narrative, and Sobieski, despite being central to victory, did not receive a permanent reward equal to the legend. The war didn't end that day either. Empires rarely die in one battle. Yet this defeat mattered because it changed momentum. The conflict expanded into the wider Great Turkish War, and by the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 the Ottomans conceded significant territory in Central Europe. Vienna was not the end of the Ottoman Empire, but it was a turning point in its European frontier, a moment when expansion slowed and the strategic balance shifted. Kara Mustafa paid the price in the harsh logic of Ottoman court politics. Later in 1683 he was executed, held responsible for the failure, and history delivered one of its coldest ironies. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which produced Sobieski and the famous cavalry, later weakened and faced pressure from neighbors. Within a century, it would be partitioned and vanished from a map for a long time. Legends also grew from the day. People talk about the winged hussar's wings as a psychological weapon, and even if the exact sound effects are debated, the psychological impact is not. War has always been fought in the mind as much as on the ground. People also tell the story of Vienna's coffee houses beginning with captured Ottoman coffee supplies. Whether or not the details are perfect, it reflects a deeper truth. Wars leave cultural traces, not just new borders. Now step back and ask the real question. Why did the Ottomans lose this day? Not because of an impossible 18,000 versus 300,000 miracle. The more honest answer is more powerful. The Ottoman siege assumed time was theirs. The coalition arrived sooner than expected. Vienna's sortie turned the siege machine into a two-front emergency, and Sobieski chose precise late-afternoon window when Ottoman cohesion was most strained and delivered a combined arms shock that the besiegers could not absorb fast enough. That's the lesson that outlives a myth. Timing beats arithmetic. Vienna didn't survive because the defenders were strong and comfortable. They were starving. It didn't survive because the relief army was perfectly rested. They were exhausted. It survived because, on one afternoon in 1683, pressure, courage, and timing aligned, and one commander committed at the exact moment the enemy could not recover its shape. If you remember one line from this story, remember this. Armies don't lose only when they run out of men. They lose when they run out of cohesion. And on September 12, 1683, cohesion broke downhill at full speed, and the siege of Vienna broke with it.